Hello, welcome to our Introduction to Homeostasis and Metabolism lecture. Homeostasis and metabolism are considered two of the basic components of what makes a living thing a living thing. So we talked about it right at the beginning of class with those charm characteristics, CHARM. The H is for homeostasis and the M is for metabolism. So we're basically going to be talking about body functions that allow the control or regulation of internal conditions of the body, as well as metabolism, which is not only the chemical reactions that are required to use energy in the body, but all the chemical reactions that are going to happen in as part of food processing, as part of building molecules that the body needs. So our definitions of these terms are really important, and we're also going to start talking today about what are the things that living, like multi-celled life, needs to do in order to stay alive. And so there's some basic sets of body functions, and we'll see that across animals and even across plants, there are some shared characteristics in how the organism goes about doing these body functions. So to start off with, the body is going to need some kind of support to hold it up. And we may have a skeleton, some rigid component to the body in animals, and muscle tissue in animals. Plants also have rigid structures to hold them up, but they don't have muscle tissue. Also, we need some kind of protection from just the outside environment, as well as from getting eaten by other organisms or damaged by other organisms. And so we're going to have some external body covering, which in animals is often called the skin, but it can more generally be called the integument. We want our integument to be integral, right, intact. We may also talk about our immune system to help protect us. And plants also have a covering that is going to keep external damage to the plant, and also they do have an immune system, although it works differently than ours does, to protect themselves from diseases and other kinds of pathogens. All organisms are going to need to do some kind of exchange of molecules with the environment, to take one thing in and to put another thing out. And our photoautotrophs, or plants, are going to take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. Animals are going to do the opposite. We're going to take in oxygen and release carbon dioxide. So we'll call that process gas exchange. And it's one of the life processes that requires us to take something in from the environment. So it's got to go from the outside of the body or the cell to the inside of the body or cell. And then we have to get rid of a waste product that also has to go to the outside. So we have these relationships between what's happening inside the body with what's happening or is available in the environment. When the organism's body gets relatively large, we have to be able to move things around inside of it. And so plants do transport with a tissue. Animals do transport, once they get fairly large, with some kind of a set of tubing and possibly a pump that we call the circulatory system. It may also have muscles involved in moving the fluid around. We need to have some way to coordinate and control everything that's going on in the body. And in animals, that's done with the nervous system and with the endocrine system. The endocrine system is a set of small body organs called glands that release hormones. And hormones are molecules that are going to be able to move around in the body and tell something that something needs to happen. We often think about that happening with our nervous system, but it also happens with the endocrine system. Plants don't have a nervous system, but they do have molecules that act the same way that hormones in animals do. So they have chemicals that can move around the body in order to take messages from one place to another. Animals are going to have to take in food. So animals are heterotrophs, so we have to take in food and process it or digest it in some way to be able to absorb the nutrients. So we're going to have a digestive system in animals. Plants don't need a digestive system. They're going to have leaves doing photosynthesis, and that's all they need. And then finally, there's going to be in animals, there's going to be body wastes that need to get removed. These are breakdown products from molecules that have gotten digested and the products of other metabolic processes. So those will get filtered out of the body fluids and moved to the outside of the body somehow. There's also food waste that gets moved to the outside of the body. Plants may secrete molecules at their roots, but they don't have digestive waste that they need to get rid of. They don't typically consume proteins that generate a lot of toxic molecules in the body, so they don't really excrete. So, right, you don't have to clean up your plant poop. You don't have to clean up after your plant like that. Right, so we have a lot of shared body functions that happen in animals and plants. And we're going to give a very brief introduction to some ideas about how all those things have to work together today. All right, so we want to define homeostasis, and we're going to start by using an example of one kind of homeostasis, thermoregulation, which is regulating body temperature. And then we're going to also talk about metabolic rate. What is it? How do we measure it? What patterns do we see in organisms as far as how their metabolic rates differ? So homeostasis is going to be defined as keeping the internal environment relatively constant or near constant. It isn't exactly constant, despite changes in the external environment. So if you imagine a mammal like a fox or a coyote outside on a snowy, cold day, the inside body temperature of its body is going to be warm, right? Even though the outside environment is cold. So that's an example of a way that the body is doing thermoregulation. It may be maintaining, using energy to maintain an internal condition that's different than what the external environment does. So there's thousands of variables that the body is constantly controlling, managing, and regulating. So we think of thermoregulation as an obvious example, at least for warm-blooded animals like mammals like us. But we can also talk about water balance, osmoregulation, how much total water there is in the body, and what are the concentrations of different ions that are in the body fluids. We carefully regulate sodium ion, chloride ion, potassium ion, all the different components that are circulating in our bloodstream, glucose, blood sugar, all of those things are carefully regulated. Your heartbeat is regulated to maintain homeostasis of blood oxygen concentration. So if your oxygen concentration in your blood starts to go down because you started exercising and your muscles are using more oxygen, your heart rate will go up because you want to circulate more blood to the places that need it. Your respiration rate will go up because you want to be absorbing more oxygen. So those are all examples of changes that happen in the body in order to maintain homeostasis, which is a set level of some bodily variable. All right, so don't think that thermoregulation is all there is to homeostasis. We'll talk about a lot more examples as we start going through different body organ systems. And plants are busy doing homeostasis too, and single-celled organisms are busy doing homeostasis too. All right, so any living organism has to be constantly managing its internal environment. If you're not in homeostasis, basically you're dead. Okay, so for every living organism. Now, metabolic rate is a way of measuring the amount of energy that's needed and used by an organism, usually over a day period. You could do it over a year, you could do it over a second, but usually we talk about it as a day, right? So that's the rate part. When we're talking about humans, we usually talk about calories per day. Calories are a measure of energy, of stored heat. And we can also talk about joules of energy. And because of the process of cellular respiration, which is going to create the stored energy in the form of ATPs, because oxygen goes into that chemical reaction, we can also use the oxygen level used during a set period of time as a way to estimate metabolic rate, because it has a fixed relationship or proportion to the amount of glucoses, of sugars that go into those cellular respiration reactions. All right. So any living organism is going to have this relationship between itself and the environment. So if we're looking at a single-celled organism like this amoeba on the left, it has to get things from the environment and has to release things into the environment. So we usually talk about this as exchange, right? And I like to think about it for one particular thing that comes in, there's some corresponding thing that needs to go out, right? So for example, oxygen goes in, carbon dioxide goes out. That's an exchange. What are we exchanging with? Well, we're exchanging something with the environment, right? So you always have to think about the terms of what's inside the body or inside the cell of the organism with what is in the environment. A single cell organism is just going to have its cell membrane separating it from the environment. But as you'll talk about more in Bio 230, that cell membrane is selectively permeable. It can regulate and control what is crossing it quite well. If we have a very simple organism, we start to see a multi-celled organism. The very simplest and small animals are all marine and aquatic. That means they're going to have a watery environment, both on the outside, and then this is a hydra, it's a small cnidarian, and it has its mouth opens up, and then it has this space or cavity, the gastrovascular cavity, and so it's always going to have water in there too. So it basically has this environment that's sort of in the semi-contained pocket, sort of inside its body, like our gut, and then also on the outside. Each cell is going to be in contact with that watery environment. It's going to be able to do exchange basically one by one with the environment. So we're talking about gas exchange, secretion or excretion of waste products. That is just going to happen by the process of diffusion. So when we see organisms that are marine or aquatic, their bodies are very small, their bodies are very thin. They're going to be able to do this exchange directly with the environment. Now, when organisms start to get larger and larger, when they're in a terrestrial environment, they're going to have certain place set aside on the body where that exchange is going to happen. It's going to have to be kept moist, because those living cells at the surface of the body that are capable of doing that exchange have to be in contact with the environment in order to do it. And so usually we're going to see that they have mucus, which is a watery sort of sticky substance that is continuously secreted across the surface of those cells that are in contact with the environment. All right, so another way to think about what's happening with the increasing size of an organism is the relationship between the surface area, which is the part that's in contact with the environment, versus the volume or the mass of the body of the organism that's sort of separated from the environment or protected on the inside. When we have a really small organism, it has quite a bit of surface area that's interacting with the environment for a given amount of volume of its body. As an organism gets larger, the volume grows. Remember, volume is pi r cubed, right? So it grows at the rate that's a cube of the radius, whereas the surface area increases by pi r squared. And so as an organism is getting bigger, its volume is getting bigger than its surface area is, right? It gets bigger faster. So where we have a small organism, or where we have a shape of the organism that has lots of little convolutions or wiggles in it, that increases the amount of surface area that's in contact with the environment. And so what we'll see over and over again anywhere we're trying to do exchange in a body organ or with a part of a body, is that in order to maximize that contact with the environment, that structure is going to have ridges, it's going to have folds, it's going to have little protrusions sticking up, and all of those things are going to increase the surface area across which exchange can happen. All right, so when we get a larger organism, we're going to see that it has a outside coating to its body. So this blob is representing an animal. And you can imagine if it were longer and skinnier, it's kind of a worm. That we're going to have a couple different things coming in, a couple different things going out. All right, so we're imagining an organism that has some kind of circulatory system inside of it. And it has a body fluid that's separate. It's stored inside of this circulatory system. So this is how mammals, how a human body systems work. So we have this structure or this tissue we call blood that is moving around inside this tubing, right? So we're going to have this circulatory system that's going to move stuff around. That allows each different body organ to do a specialized job. And then whatever work it does ends up getting shared with the rest of the body. So we have this job specialization, like when we become a multi-celled organism and we start to see differentiation of cells doing different jobs. In the body of a larger animal, we're going to see different body organs doing different jobs, and then they all share with one another the work that they've done through the circulatory system. All right, so where we have oxygen coming in and carbon dioxide going out. So we have the respiratory system. It has to have a moist surface of living cells in order to do that exchange across. So we're going to have this sometimes in animals like ourselves, we have this in pocket, right? So we sort of have a little dimple that goes into the body. And then we have sort of like a balloon with many convolutions to make it high surface area that's sort of sticking into the body. So it's like a semi-enclosed area. There's actually air going into and out of the respiratory system. All right, so as we inhale and exhale, we're forcing air into and out of the spaces in our lungs. There's a connection between the outside environment and the inside of those spaces in the lung. It's continuous with the exterior world. And that is where we can absorb the oxygen and remove the carbon dioxide, right? When we take food into the mouth, right, the gut is going to be this continuous tube, goes all the way through the body. At the anus, it connects with the outside world again. All right, so even though this, whatever food, as it's getting digested and moving through our gut, it's still actually outside of the body. Right. And when we break it down with chemical reactions in the gut and break it down into the tiniest molecules that can cross over a cell membrane and move into our circulatory system, then that is when those food molecules actually get inside of our body. Right. It blew my mind when I first learned it in my college biology class. Wait, the inside of our gut is actually outside of our body. Right, because it is continuous with the external environment, right? So we aren't going to say that something is actually inside the body until it has crossed a cell membrane. Right, so as we're absorbing molecules from the digested food in our gut, those molecules actually have to go across the cell membrane. Those epithelial cells that are lining the inside of the digestive tract are going to have lots of transport proteins that are going to be moving those food molecules. They're going to go from the gut into the circulatory system. All right, now as we break down food molecules and we do other metabolic processes in the body, there's going to be molecules that we make as waste products that we want to get rid of, either because we have too much of them, right? So we've had a really salty food day. We went to a party, we ate a lot of chips or whatever. We want to get rid of the excess salt. We need salt, but we want to have the right amount, right? So if we have extra, we want to get rid of that. Also, we have waste products that are toxic. As we break down proteins, we make ammonia, which disintegrates cell membranes, right? So we want to get that out of the body. once it's been moved from the gut into the circulatory system, the only way we can get it, right? The circulatory system is continuous. Stuff isn't supposed to get out of it, right? If you're a breach in your circulatory system, that's bad. Right, so we have to have a way to move those molecules that we don't want out of the body. So we have an excretory organ. That is going to be something that is going to be able to move stuff we want to get rid of from the circulatory system into some kind of tubing that is going to connect with the outside world so that we can move those molecules into a fluid that can then flow out of the body and remove those molecules that we don't want. All right, so in our body, that's the kidney, and we'll come back to it later, right? We just are trying to get an overview of all the stuff that's coming into and going out of the body, right? So metabolic waste products, those are going to have a chemical reaction happen inside of a cell of the body. We want to get rid of that stuff that we're going to pass in our urine. And then unabsorbed matter, or undigestive or undigestible and unabsorbed, is going to be passed out the anus. All that leftover stuff is fecal matter, right? Poop. Now, the way we get stuff in between body structures and the circulatory system partly also is going to rely on the fact that there are cells throughout our body, and they have these little spaces in between them, right? So the spaces in between the cells are called interstices, and it's not dry, it's not empty, right? It's going to be filled with a fluid. This fluid is called interstitial fluid, and it just means that it's body fluid that's not inside the circulatory system. It's not inside the gut, all right? It's sort of filling up spaces. So if you've ever sort of scraped your finger and it wasn't scraped enough to get to a capillary to bleed, but some kind of clear liquid oozed out of it, that's interstitial fluid, right? So it's filling up the spaces in between your normal cells. So materials can diffuse out of the circulatory system into these spaces in between the cells, and then actually into the cells from there. All right, so an oxygen molecule actually has to make its way outside the circulatory system, diffuse across some little space, and then actually diffuse into a cell that needs it. All right, so the internal compartments of a large organism are all going to be very separated and highly regulated in terms of what job different organs do. Right? So we see here that we have these different types of jobs that need to be done. We have digestion, we have respiration, we have excretion, we have circulation. Is going to be the way that their work is all connected together. All right, so we want to keep these systems working in a coordinated way. All right, so in animals, there's two ways that we can coordinate the actions of all of these systems. That is with the nervous system via nerves or nerve cells, and also the endocrine system. All right, so the endocrine system is going to release hormones. Hormones are molecules that are used for signaling. So there's a wide variety of different types of molecules that act as hormones, and we'll come back to that in more detail later on. But we want to just get the idea now that we have this set of systems in the body, and they work together to make sure that whatever needs to happen in the body does happen, and it happens in a coordinated way. So often there isn't just one thing that needs to happen. If something changes in the body, you start exercising, right? You're going to need to get more oxygen to your muscle cells. You're going to need to get more glucose to your muscle cells. You need to sort of turn off some body processes that aren't important while you're exercising, like digestion. And you want to turn on to a higher level body parts that are important when you're exercising. And so the brain is going to send messages to some of the parts of the body directly with nerves, right? So there's a nerve bundle that goes to your heart straight from your brain, and it regulates the pace of the contractions of your heart. But when you need to release more glucose into your bloodstream, the way that happens is by a hormone message, right? So the hormone is released from the pancreas that goes to parts of the body where glucose is stored, which is both muscle tissues and in the liver. And it gives those different parts of the body the same message, which is to release glucose into the bloodstream. Right, so we have different things that need to be happening. We have different body organs. Some of them, the brain is telling what to do. Some of them are processes that are kind of turned on automatically if they're incredibly important to your basic life functions, that you don't have to have a thought to increase your heart rate. There is a set of almost like a computer program that takes over and causes that to happen. Right, so these two body systems are going to cooperate, and they're going to act in such a way, not only to sort of do a process that we sort of decide that we're going to do, but they're also going to function automatically in order to keep regulating all of those body systems that we need to keep at a particular set point. Right. So the way that those processes work is that there has to be some way that the nervous system can detect that particular concentration of that molecule. So a lot of the actual structures within the body that are detecting the point of the level of these variables, we call them sensors. So it's sort of like you have a thermostat in your hallway, or you have a, if you're diabetic, you can take a drop of your blood and it will go into this little machine that says what the glucose concentration is. There are cellular components and nerve cell components that are able to do that in the body. So for example, we can detect temperatures inside the body, because the shapes of proteins change at different temperatures. And so there's a very sensitive set of proteins that change their shape when our body gets too hot or too cold, that allows the nervous system to say, wait, we're too hot or we're too cold. Right. So we want to be a certain set point. That's the right one for our physiology. And what happens when we start exercising or we get sick is that, or when it's just hot outside or cold outside, the body starts to change temperature, either gets too hot or it gets too cold. That sensor is going to detect that happening. The sensor is going to send a message to some kind of control center, right? That could be the brain. It could be, depending on the organism, it could be another gland. It could be a ganglion, right? Some messages in our body don't go all the way to our brain. There's these kind of big lumps of nerves near our spinal cord. And there's a lot of body functions that just aren't important enough to go to our brain, or they're so stereotyped that they don't need to go all the way to the brain. So that control center is then going to send a message, usually by the nervous system, to turn on something that's going to fix that problem, right? So you want to imagine that normally we're in a state of homeostasis. Something happens inside the body or in the environment that pushes that variable away from its normal range, right? We want to turn on some kind of process that's going to push that variable back to where it's supposed to be, right? So imagine the temperature example. If we are getting too hot, then one of the things our body can do is start to make sweat happen. So these little muscles at the base of the sweat glands will relax, and it will make the sweat ooze out onto the surface, right? So putting water on the surface of the body allows it to be evaporated off the surface of the body. And as you know from chemistry, that it takes energy in order to move water from its liquid state to its gaseous state, so from liquid water to water vapor. The heat of vaporization is the amount of energy that that takes. And so when that water evaporates off of our body surface, it takes that heat away from the surface of the body, right? So sweating would be the response, and then the body gets cooled because of the sweating, right? So this red arrow on here with the negative sign is important because what has been turned on in the body is what's called a negative feedback loop, right? We see a loop here on this screen, but what it really means is that we've been deflected from our set point. A process happens that pushes back the other direction. So if we think of that change as a plus, a positive number, then that response is a negative number. All right, so our temperature gets too high, something happens to push it down again, or it increases, we want to subtract from it. A negative feedback loop is critical to maintaining homeostasis. In fact, homeostasis is maintained by negative feedback loops, because the whole idea of it is if we get out of our normal range, we want to go back to it. There are also things called positive feedback loops. Now, the positive and the negative don't imply that there is something good or bad about these loops, right? So these negative feedback loops are really, really good. The negative part just means it acts in opposition or in the opposite way from the stimulus in the first place. A positive feedback loop is going to be something that once a change happens, it's going to tend to enhance it, all right? So often we talk about, a perfect storm or a cascade, or a set of events get started and then things kind of snowball. So these sort of snowballing responses are examples of a positive feedback loop. And what happens in a positive feedback loop is that there is some change, and that change tends to make that change continue to happen, right? So we'll talk about a couple examples. It's not very, it doesn't happen very much in the body, and but it does happen in other things. So we already talked about the extinction vortex, right? The extinction vortex is a positive feedback loop, right? Not because it's good, but because once a population gets small, things happen that make it get even smaller, right? So it's reinforced, right? Other examples are when you're running late, right? And you do something because you're distracted and you're stressed out from running late, like you leave your wallet at home or you're speeding, right? So, then you realize you forgot your wallet and you have to go back and get it, and now you're even later, right? So something happens that ends up making it worse, right? All right, so basically homeostasis is maintained by negative feedback loops that work because of the action of the nervous and endocrine systems. All right, so we're gonna look at thermoregulation a little bit more detail, because it's fairly easy to see the things that happen and have to do with thermoregulation. So we're not only going to talk about a hormone feedback loop, but we're going to talk about all the processes that are happening that work to change the temperature of the body, and the kinds of things that a body can have, adaptations that help to maintain homeostasis. All right, so if we imagine that fox that's outside on a cold, snowy day, it's got this thick fur, right? So the presence of the fur, the existence of the fur, and how thick it is and how warm it is are an example of an adaptation that are going to help the animal maintain homeostasis, right? If you took a fox and you shaved its fur off, it would freeze to death if it went outside, but the fur allows it to maintain its homeostasis, okay? All right, so we want to understand how heat is going to either be released from the body or absorbed by the body. And we have to come back to some physics in order to understand that. Physics, chemistry, physics. All right, so heat by definition is energy in transit. It's going to be moving from areas of high to areas of low. That's what it does, it moves. And so we have 4 mechanisms of heat transfer. And the difference between them is how the heat, what medium the heat is in, whether it's in a solid or whether it's in a liquid, or whether the heated stuff that's moving is the air. And it also depends on what is touching the organism we're talking about. All right, so we've got radiation, evaporation, convection, and conduction. Radiation is defined as an emission of electromagnetic rays, and they're going to strike molecules. So we have this energy coming from the sun. It's a mixed wavelengths, and what happens is when those wavelengths of light bump into a molecule, they can transfer some of their energy to that molecule. All right, so radiation, basically, if you're standing outside on a sunny day, you feel it, right? You start to feel warmer. That's because the energy from those waves, the waves of energy are getting transferred to the molecules of your skin. Some will get reflected, right? So this little arrow that's showing some getting bounced off. White, light colors, shiny colors, those are going to reflect the energy of the wavelengths of light coming in. So if we want to increase the amount of radiation, of heating by radiation, then we'll see darker colors, matte surfaces. If we want to prevent heating from radiation, then we'll see organisms with light colored and somewhat reflective surfaces. Right, evaporation is a process of heat leaving as water is turned from liquid to vapor. So we talked about that a minute ago with sweat, right? So we can have evaporative cooling because that heat of vaporization is leaving with the water vapor. And all animals are going to have some evaporation when we're breathing, right? Because the inside of the lungs is coated with that mucus, so there's water on the surface. As we're taking air in and then exhaling it, some of the water from that surface coating is going to go with it, right? So you can see evidence of this if you breathe onto a cold glass, like a window, and your breath causes a little cloud. So the reason why is that water vapor that's inside your lungs, as you exhale it and it touches that cold glass, it condenses. And so you can see how much water vapor is actually in your exhaled air when you are in that situation. Convection and conduction are heat transfer either between, because of the movement of a fluid in the case of convection, or because 2 solids are next to one another and one's warmer, right? So in conduction, the things have to actually be touching, right? And so the molecules are actually in contact. So if you're sitting on a warm bench, the molecules of the bench are actually vibrating because they're warmer, and they're going to start to vibrate the molecules of your behind just because they're touching. So that warmth kind of just rubs off, literally. Convection is where we have a fluid flowing over a surface. So that can be air, it can be water. And as that air or water moves by, and it's heated, as it moves away, it will take that heat with it, right? So if you're sitting in a still space of air, your body is going to be heating the air around it. And then if suddenly a gust of wind comes, then it's going to move that heated air away. That is heat loss by convection, right? So if you've been exercising and you're a little chilly, or you're sweating and you're hot, and then the air was cooled off a little bit and you get a little wind blowing across you, all of a sudden you feel cooler. That's because that heat is leaving you by convection. All right, so when we look across all different kinds of organisms, there are some that actively regulate their internal body temperature and others that do not. right? And there are organisms that don't need to regulate their internal body temperature because they're in an environment that's at a very constant temperature. So like in the deep sea, the temperature just does not change ever. So they're always the same temperature. But there's organisms that mostly are going to have their body temperature change if the temperature of the environment changes. And then there's other organisms that are going to actively control their body temperature, make it independent from the external environment. And so that no matter what happens to that environmental temperature, at least within the range that life can be supported at, that their temperature is going to stay the same, right? So animals like the river otter, which is considered a temperature regulator, the fancy way to say it is that it is an endotherm, right? It is endothermic. Endo means inside, right? So that the body temperature is basically controlled from the inside. We can see that as the temperature of the environment changes, the body temperature, the internal temperature of the otter doesn't change, right? So we'd also call that warm-blooded. Our bass, which is a fish, is the opposite of that. The temperature doesn't come from its internal processes, it comes from the environment. So we call those ectothermic, and that means the body temperature mostly depends on the environment. So there are some organisms that are somewhat able to maintain an internal body temperature. So it gets really complicated when you start talking about, say really, really large pelagic fish that can, they stay a little warmer than the environment no matter what, because they're swimming and there's some heat created from that. All right, but just in real general terms, we can group organisms into ones that thermoregulate actively or that do not. So our bass, our fish here, when it's really cold outside, it's going to be cold. And if it's really warm outside, its body's going to be warm. Think about how the rate of chemical reaction depends on temperature, right? And how many chemical reactions are going on in the body of a living organism all the time. So in this temperature conformer or ectothermic organism, when it's cold outside, it is going to decrease all of its metabolic functions because all those chemical reactions are just going to happen more slowly. Same thing when its body is hot. All of its chemical reactions are going to heat up, right? They're going to speed up. So there's a trade-off in these two different strategies, right? So the temperature conformer isn't using any body energy to make sure that its temperature stays the same. So it saves a lot of energy doing that, but it may not be able to function very well when the temperature is cold, and it's going to use a lot of energy when the temperature is warm. Right? So it may not have its internal body functions are not as well regulated because they're dependent on the external temperature. So our endothermic animal, or our river otter, it uses a lot of daily energy to do this temperature regulation. Theoretically, if you had eaten enough food, you could keep your body temperature high enough to survive indefinitely, even if the temperature is cold outside. If it gets cold enough, the damage starts to occur to the tissues. But so there's a benefit, and that is it doesn't matter the temperature. The animal is able to be active, to look for food, to run away from predators. But the cost is that it needs to eat a lot more. All right, so we'll come to a slide in a minute that compares the daily metabolic rates of endothermic and ectothermic animals. Plants are also temperature conformers. They're actually able to regulate their body temperature a little bit, but they aren't the same as endotherms as like mammals and birds, right? So mammals and birds are the only groups that are able to do this internal temperature regulation. We look across a snowy landscape. Those are the only kinds of animals we see out and about. Right, so all the other animal phyla, everything from sponges and jellyfish on to fish and reptiles, they are these ectothermic organisms. All right, so looking at a couple different mechanisms that allow us to regulate temperature. So we're talking about mammals here. We start at homeostasis, and this slide is showing that there isn't just one feedback loop, that there's actually two. All right, so these are two different processes that are going to happen, and the very best way that we have to regulate a particular variable in our body is that we have a set of processes we can turn on if it gets too high. And we also have a set of processes we can turn on if it gets too low, right? Rarely can we do one thing and it fixes both too high and too low, right? We're going to have something different that the body does if the variable is too high from when it's too low, right? So if you're in your house and it's too cold, you don't turn on the air conditioning, you turn on the heater, right? But if it's too warm, then you turn on the air conditioning. You don't want to have the air conditioning and the heating going on at the same time, right? Because that wastes energy. Same thing in our bodies. We want to do just enough to return the body to homeostasis. All right, so if the temperature is increased because it's hot outside or because we've been exercising, the brain is going to detect that. Right? So there's a part of the brain called the hypothalamus. That's going to send a message to your sweat glands, and it's also going to send a message to your circulatory system. The surface of our body is the place where we're in contact with the environment. So if we want to get heat away from our body, the place we have to do that is at the surface. So we're going to divert more blood flow to the surface of the body. And so the capillaries in the skin will have their little openings increased so that more blood flows to them. And that heat will be available, right, and near the surface, so that when we start to sweat, that the heat will be removed by the heat of vaporization. Those two processes should start to make the body cool again, right? And so the internal temperature will decrease. And when it gets back to the right temperature level, then these processes get turned off, right? Now, there's a little time lag, right? So you're going to keep sweating a little bit after you stop exercising, right? Because the body temperature is still high. It takes it a little while for it to cool down. So you're going to keep sweating. You know, if you're in a huge rush, it is possible to do a workout, jump in the shower really fast, jump out again, put your clothes on, and discover that you're still sweating from your workout. So you can yeah, then your shower didn't quite do the trick. So, right, so these mechanisms can take a little bit of time. The opposite things happen. Our body gets cold. Either we're sick or we're in a cold environment, or we've been sitting still for a long time. Sort of opposite things are going to happen. Opposite thing happens with the capillaries, restrict the blood flow to the surface. If the outside environment is cold, we don't want our blood to be moving around close to that outside environment, getting cooled off, and then moving into the rest of the body. So we decrease the blood flowing to the surface of the body. And then to try and increase warmth inside the body, the skeletal muscles will start contracting. All right, so this is called shivering. It's different than a muscle contraction we do on purpose, right? Sometimes when we're feeling cold, we might actually, you know, move around a little bit, kind of stamp our feet, maybe jump a little in place. We also have the option of putting on a jacket or something warmer, a hat. Right, so behaviors can also play into maintaining homeostasis as well. And those are usually, for an organism like ourselves, those are going to be the first thing that we do. We don't want to wait till we're cold enough that we're shivering. We want to move into the sunshine. We want to move, put on something warm, turn on the heat in the house. But if those things don't work, all right, then we're going to have this uncontrollable contraction of the muscles. Muscle contraction actually both generates a little heat from friction, and also because we're burning glucoses in order to fuel those muscle contractions, a little bit of the energy is lost as heat. And so it's going to increase the body temperature. As the body temperature warms back up again, the shivering will stop, the blood flow will return to normal. There's also a mechanism that the body can use, which is really neat. When we talk about burning glucoses or burning sugars in order to get the energy from them, usually our process in cellular respiration is going to take the energy stored in the glucose and it's going to turn it into energy stored in ATPs. If we're cold or if we have a lot of excess glucose available, the body can actually choose to just burn it, right? To just break those bonds and release the energy from them as heat rather than converting them into ATPs, right? So this is called thermogenesis, and it's another way that the body can heat itself, right? Sometimes if you've overeaten, your body temperature will actually start to raise. You'll feel warm and flushed, maybe even sweat a little. It's because your body's like, whoa, there's too many calories in here. Let's just burn some, right? We don't want to store this. We don't want to, you know, we got too many calories here. All right. All right, so when we're looking at the body, we have a whole host of adaptations that are helping us control our body temperature. So when we think about, whales that live in the Arctic, we know that they have that really thick layer of blubber or fat underneath their skin. So even thin humans do also have a layer of fat or adipose tissue, which is shown in this slide, underlaying the skin. Women have a thicker layer than men do, no matter what. And the reason that fat is good in terms of helping us maintain our body temperature is that it's an insulator, right? And an insulator is something that prevents transfer, right? So when we think about insulation that we put onto our houses, like that fluffy fiberglass stuff, what it does is it prevents heat from moving through it, right? So some things transmit heat very easily. Like if you have a real silver spoon in your hot cup of tea or coffee, then the handle of that spoon is going to get really hot, just as hot as the part that's in the cup, because it transfers the energy because of the material that it's made out of. Fat molecules do not let heat go through them, right? Kind of like a wetsuit, right? So the role of it is as insulation. Right now, we also have these hairs sticking up out of our skin, and shown on this diagram, there's only a couple of hairs there. It's not very impressive. But if you think back to that fox or to a sea otter or other animals that do live outside where it's cold, their density of their furs is really high, right? So all those furs are all packed together. And what happens is that as they're, especially when they're fluffed up, what they do is they create an airspace. So the skin, the warm skin of the animal is down here. All of the hairs and then they lap over on the top. They're separating that airspace next to the skin from all the airspace that's outside of it, right? So the heat that's escaping from the body gets trapped in that warm airspace. And so what the hairs do is they act as an insulator, right? They're going to separate the space of the air that's right next to the skin from the air that's not next to the skin, that really cold air from the outside. So it's going to prevent heat loss by convection, because the air that's right next to the skin is not flowing away. It's trapped right there, right? And this is actually how a wetsuit works as well. It doesn't really work because the neoprene is an insulator entirely. It works because it fits you tightly. There's a small amount of water that's inside the wetsuit. Right? When you first get in the water, you're like, ooh, that little cold water rushing down your neck. But once that water is inside the wetsuit, your body warms it up, right? So you've got the warm water that's right next to your skin, the insulating layer of the neoprene. Again, it isn't quite so much as important that it stops the heat from being transferred, but that it keeps that water that's warm against your body and it doesn't let it get swooshed away by the cold water that's on the outside. All right, so hair or fur, feathers as well are going to create that separate airspace to allow the to stop the heat transfer into the whole outside. We already talked about the sweat glands, right? Not all animals have them, but those that do can sweat, right? Your dog can't sweat, it has to pant, right? And the reason that it doesn't have sweat glands, they mess up its fur, is the reason it pants is because it's actually evaporating. Their tongue get really big and really pink. It's evaporating water off of the surface of the tongue and it's cooling it, cooling its body that way. The tongue gets really pink because it's increasing the blood flow to the tongue in order to move the heat from the inside of the body to the place where the heat is escaping. Right, so there are these little muscles that are fastened to the hairs. The hairs can be laying down flat. They can also be pointed up, right? When it's really cold, they get pointed up more. So if you ever get goosebumps or chicken skin on your arm when you're cold, that's all those little hairs. They're sticking up. They're trying to keep you warm, but there's too few of them to do any good. If you were a fox, on the other hand, that would work quite well. All right. And like we talked about as well, these little blood vessels that go to the surface of the skin, these are the ones where the blood flow is going to be regulated, either to keep it from going close to the surface if the outside is cold, or to move blood so that it is close to the surface if we want to get rid of excess heat. Right, so we look at all these structures that are cleverly embedded into just our skin. We're just talking about the skin. That are there to help us maintain that internal body temperature. All right, so organisms that live in really cold environments have a couple of fascinating adaptations. This slide is showing in a somewhat confusing way two examples of the same thing. And this example is, again, it's some clever physics. Some clever physics. And the idea is that as blood is flowing from the very warmest part of the body, sort of the middle, as it's going to the extremities, to the parts that are going to be small and thin and in contact with that cold environment, the blood is going to cool as it's going into those body parts. But all you need to do in order to prevent that cooled blood from going back into the main part of the body and making it cold, it turns out you just have to put the vein and the artery that are going to and from that body part next to one another, right? And then the heat does its thing. It goes down its concentration gradient, right? It goes from high to low, and it maintains the internal body temperature because the blood that's warm, that's going away from the heart, so arteries going away from the heart, so the blood is flowing away from the body, right? And the environment is cooling it, right? So it's going to get cooler and cooler. This poor Canada goose is standing on ice. Its feet are very cold, right? But the blood is going to cool, and then when it turns around and comes back towards the heart in the vein, it's right next to the artery, right? So this blood is cooling as it goes towards the foot. It's cold by the time it turns around and starts going back, and it's colder than the blood in the artery that's next to it. So heat is going to move from the artery to the vein all the way across, and that warms the blood back up again. So you're actually sort of stealing the heat from the body, from the blood that's leaving the body while it's still warm, right? You're stealing it to warm the blood back up again as it goes back towards the heart. right? So it's cooled off a little bit, but it hasn't cooled off very much, right? And because it's coldest after it's passed by the, freezing goose foot, there's always a gradient from one side to the other, and that's going to keep moving some of the heat. So you're actually cooling the blood that's flowing towards the foot by transferring the heat to the returning blood as well. So this is called a counter current flow, counter current. And it just means that the artery and the vein going out to some cold extremity are right next to one another, right? So this isn't some crazy complicated evolutionary mechanism. It's just put them next to one another, and then the that extremity will cool, right? You're going to say, let's sacrifice the feet, let's let them get cold, but the whole body won't get cooled from that exposure. All right, so we're going to shift gears and talk a little bit about metabolic rate and some of the important things about that we know about how metabolic rates differ between different kinds of organisms. And so this diagram is showing, again, a schematic or a simplified diagram. In this picture, our animal is just a rectangle. And we've got the inside, right, that's under control of the organism, and then we have the external environment out of it. So we're going to look at what molecules are coming into the body. We're sort of ignoring, oxygen. We're going to assume there's enough oxygen coming in, and we're going to talk about the organic molecules that come into the body as food, right? So we need to get all of our energy from the foods that we eat, the energy stored in the chemical bonds of the molecules of the food that we eat. All right, so the food comes in, we've got to digest and absorb it. We actually are using energy, right? I don't know if anybody's ever told you that you use more energy chewing and digesting celery than it has calories in it, right? So if you're, watching your weight, eat as much celery as you want, which might not be that much, but so we're going to lose some energy as heat, like we talked about in the last ecology unit, that there's some energy that is going to go into the feces. We aren't going to be able to absorb it, all that plant, all that fiber, plant material that we can't digest. Some of it's going to just go out of the body. So we end up getting nutrient molecules into the body cells, right? So they have to cross the cell membrane. We get it into the cell. Some molecules are going to still have energy in them when we get rid of them, when we excrete them, like these nitrogenous wastes. So we've got to get rid of them. They still have some energy. We're letting that energy go. All right, all the energy that's left is going to go into cellular respiration, for example. So glucose and other carbon chain molecules are going to go into cellular respiration. Some of the energy is going to be lost as heat. Some of it's going to be stored as ATPs. Some of the products of cellular respiration and also some of the other molecules that are broken down from digesting our food are going to be some carbon skeletons. So some subcomponents, some of the carbons from these larger biological macromolecules that came in with our food. Remember the 4 kinds of biological macromolecules: carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, and lipids. These carbon skeletons can be used to build any other molecule that we need in the body, right? So we're going to be breaking down molecules that come in as food, chopping them up into their component parts, and then we're going to reassemble them together into exactly the molecules we need, right? So biosynthesis is going to take those carbon skeletons, it's going to build them up into whatever other molecules we need, right? We need lots of other kinds of molecules in the body, not just glucoses. So if you're exercising, if you're trying to build muscle mass, those proteins, those amino acids that we break down from the foods we eat, those get transported into the cells of the muscles that you've been working, and then they get built into actins and myosins that are going to be adding into the muscle cells in your body. All of these processes, all of those building up of new molecules requires energy. There's going to be enzymes that are going to be doing those chemical reactions. They all need ATPs. This is all work, okay? So chopping up molecules in our gut is done by enzymes. It takes energy, it's work. All right, cellular respiration is going to produce energy stored in ATPs, and then all of the things the cell needs to do during the day, all the housekeeping, all the tidying up, all of the making of things, copying the DNA, repairing things, building new structures, making molecules to be secreted, all the chores that our cells do every day. It takes energy to do every single one of those things. I'm exhausted just talking about it. All right, so we were going to power the body with the energy that was stored in the food that we got during the day. As you see, we're losing some of it as heat. Some of it's going to be used to do work in the body. If we don't have enough during the day, right, we may pull energy from stored molecules in fats and in glucose is stored in the muscles and in the liver. Right, if we're getting too much energy during the day, more than we're using, it's going to get stored in the body as fats. All right, so this idea of is there too much, is there too little energy or food coming in is related to what we consider the metabolic rate. How much energy do we actually exactly need during the day, right? So it'll depend on what our day looks like, whether we worked out or not, but it's actually pretty close on average from one day to the next. All right, so that diagram that I just showed you was a very, very big overview, simplified diagram. It didn't call out each cellular chemical reaction by name. All right, but this one does. All right, this is a map of every chemical reaction that happens in E. coli. So Escherichia coli is a bacteria that is model organism for all kinds of study. And this is a single-celled prokaryote. All right, so it's one of the simplest kinds of organisms that there is. And look at all the different molecules. So each dot represents a specific molecule, and each line represents a chemical reaction that converts it into a different molecule. All right, so we've got the citric acid cycle here in the middle. We've got the other different types of things happening in the cell during the day. We've got lipid metabolism, we've got amino acid metabolism, you know, so all the different chemical reactions, right? So we maybe think the simple explanation of what metabolism is taking in and using energy, but a more sophisticated or higher level understanding of what metabolism is all the chemical reactions that happen in the body and in the cells, right? And so there's thousands in a large complex organism like ourselves, right? So I'm not going to ask you anything about this diagram on the test. I'm not going to expect you to redraw it or anything, but just I want you to feel in awe of the complexity and the number of different molecules that are involved in the life processes of even a bacteria. All right, so when we go from thinking about bacteria to thinking about animals that are more familiar to us, when we look at how much energy they need during the day, we might expect to see that as the animal gets bigger, they need more energy during the day. You would expect an elephant to eat more than a squirrel or a mouse, right? Okay, and they do, right? They do. So we've got body mass in kilograms on the x-axis. It's on a log scale so that we can get the mouse and the elephant on the same graph. And what we have on the y-axis is basal metabolic rate, BMR, basal metabolic rate, like at the base of. And basal metabolic rate is actually kind of a hypothetical thing. It is assuming you're not exercising, you haven't eaten, you're at an extremely low state of metabolic activity that we typically aren't usually at. But the idea of it is sort of what's the bare minimum of energy that's needed. So our normal daily energy intake is a little higher than the BMR. So basal metabolic rate on this graph is measured as liters of oxygen per hour. All right, so it's a rate. That means it's going to be divided by a time. And like I said earlier, we don't have to measure it in glucoses, right? We can measure it in oxygens because oxygens and glucoses are proportional to one another in that chemical equation for cellular respiration. In fact, they're 1-to-1. All right. So it is true that as animals get bigger, their energy needs for the day get bigger as well. All right. However, it's a little more complicated than that. So this is a graph. Now it's decreasing as we go from the left to the right. And we see the mouse is over on the left and the elephant over on the right. And what's different about this graph, we still have body mass per kilogram on a log scale on the x-axis, but the y-axis, the only thing that's different is that we've taken the BMR and we've actually divided it by the kilograms of the animal. All right, so we aren't just looking at its total. Right? The total amount the elephant eats per day is bigger than the total amount the mouse eats. But when we take the amount the elephant eats and divide it by the elephant's weight, right, or mass, and we do the same thing with the mouse, we find the mouse actually has a higher metabolic rate per kilo than the elephant does, right? Now, the elephant is extremely large. And what happens as the animal's body gets bigger, so imagine the animal's just a sphere, right, to simplify things. What's happening as the animal gets bigger is that the volume is increasing faster than the surface area. Where do we lose heat? We lose heat at our surface, right? So if we're talking about an endothermic animal, which we are for all of these examples, that even in a warm climate, right, that heat is going to be lost at the surface of the animal. So the higher the surface area relative to the volume, the more heat is going to be lost per kilo or per gram of the animal, right? So basically, the mouse has a higher surface area compared to how much mouse there is than the elephant does compared to how much elephant there is. So the elephant's losing less heat during the day just because it's big, all right? And so the elephant is going to eat more based on its size, but not as much more as we would expect, okay? Because it gets kind of a benefit just from being big. We hear about economies of scale in business, right? If you order, 5, greeting cards online, they're going to cost you a lot each. But if you order 500, they're going to cost less per each. Right. So we say that, we get a bulk discount, or they're cheaper when you buy a lot. We go to Costco and buy, 24 rolls of toilet paper because they're cheaper that way. Right. So we get that bulk discount. It's not exactly the same mechanism for this example, but it's the same idea that the animal that's larger kind of gets a discount. It doesn't have to eat as many calories per gram as a smaller animal does. All right, and here is another slide that explains this in a little more detail. This can be kind of a challenging thing to understand, and I just found this explanation. So if you want to read this, I'll give you a minute, or you can pause the video. All right, so our last topic is thinking about how much different organisms use energy in different ways, or how much they need. So our first comparison, there's a lot on this slide, so we'll take a minute with it. Our first comparison I want to make is between an endotherm and an ectotherm. So remember that we said earlier that an ectotherm is going to be an organism that mainly relies on the temperature of the environment rather than controlling it from the inside, whereas an endotherm is an organism that's going to maintain its internal body temperature, and it requires a great deal of energy to do that. All right, so we're going to see how much difference the energy is. So we want to take a similar sized animal. So we have on this slide, we have a 4-kilo penguin in Antarctica, and we have a 4-kilo snake. So if we look at the total calories, the annual energy expenditure, just they happen to have added it up this way. We've got 340,000 kcals per hour is the annual energy expenditure. And it's 8,000 for the snake. All right, so just being an endotherm means that you are spending two orders of magnitude more total energy in order to get that benefit of staying at that constant temperature. All right, so if we compare within endotherms, we've got a 60-kilo female human, 800,000 kcals compared to the penguin. And then when we look at the mouse, only 4,000, right? The mouse is only a 0.025 kilos. All right, so the mouse is smaller than the snake. So it's so much smaller though, that even though it's an endotherm, it's still taking in fewer calories, right? If you've ever had a snake for a pet or another reptile for a pet, they don't eat as often, right? You don't have to feed them every day. They aren't gobbling up food like your dog is, right? They just don't need as much. All right, okay, so the next thing we want to look at is how do these organisms spend the energy? What do they spend it on? So we have in turquoise, we have basal metabolic rate. So how much energy does it take just to stay alive? Just to run the background, like when your phone is asleep and it's on, but it's not doing anything, that's sort of the basal metabolic rate. Now we have individuals investing in reproduction in the case of all of these examples. So there's a little sliver here for reproduction. Thermoregulation is shown in gold. Growth, there's a little sliver of it here for human. There isn't a sliver of it here for these other organisms except for the snake. Right? Once a mouse and a penguin reach adult size, they don't grow, they stop growing. However, a lot of other kinds of organisms do continue to grow throughout their lives. All right, so fish, a lot of other reptiles, they'll continue to grow. So as much extra energy as they have, they'll grow. Now, this little sliver here, this small amount, just represents that as humans get older, we tend to gain about 1 pound a year. So that growth is not in height, it's it's in diameter. And so activity, right? So more than half of the basal metabolism is actually another about that much is added on to make our actual metabolism for the day. The mouse, if we look at the biggest pi wedge in each of these graphs, we have a fairly large animal over here. More than half of its energy is just BMR, right? We get to the penguin, and activity is more important. We get to the mouse, all right, thermoregulation is the most important. Now the snake has no pi wedge over here for this gold color thermoregulation because it doesn't do it. It doesn't spend any energy on it, right? Whatever temperature it is out there, the snake just is that temperature itself. All right, so a couple big differences here. The amount of energy spent proportionate to the total expenditure gets bigger the smaller the animal. A lot fewer calories for a similar sized ectotherm compared to an endotherm. And then in all of these individuals, reproduction is a fairly small pi wedge. It's a little bigger for the mouse. And so depending on your body size and your type of metabolism, whether you're an endotherm or an ectotherm, you're going to have these different looking energy budgets for the day. All right. So what happens to animals during a time of year when it's hard for them to get as many calories as they need in order to stay warm, or even if they can stay warm at all? Right. So what we find is that ectotherms, if it gets too cold for them to be active during a part of the year, they'll hibernate. They'll dig into a burrow, or they'll basically go into a very low metabolic state. They're so cold that they can't function. But warm-blooded animals that are out and about have a couple options, and depending on their evolutionary history, they're going to do one or the other of these things. All right, so we know that bears hibernate, so some kinds of animals will put on a lot of extra fat during the summer, and then they'll basically go and sleep through the winter. And the reason they do that is because their food resources aren't available during the winter. If food resources are available, like our fox is going to be out and about during the winter. It can catch enough food that it can maintain its needed metabolic rate. All right, so it's an evolutionary decision based on the availability of the needed resources. We have other organisms that say, forget it, I'm just going to go somewhere else that isn't as cold, right? So we have seasonal migrations, where some bird species are going to fly south and spend the winter in a tropical habitat that's warmer, that has, say, insects and seeds and fruits that the animal needs to eat. They have it there during that part of the year, whereas those resources aren't available during the winter in the place where they go in the summer to do their reproduction. Why would they bother to do that? Well, the environment for raising a family, doing their reproduction, is better in that northern climate. There are fewer predators. There's abundant resources during the summer, right? So they're making this whole migration based on the quality of the habitat for raising the young versus the quality of habitat for living the rest of the year. All right, so if we do have an organism that is not out in active during a period of time, we say that they're doing dormancy. All right, so they're going to decrease their metabolic rate, and this is more than being asleep. It's actually shutting down the different aspects of the metabolism to a greater degree than even sleep is. So humans, we don't have this. We don't have the ability to do this torpor or this dormancy, right? If you watch movies where people are going in space and they're going on really long journeys, and they go into cryo sleep, or they have some kind of technologically driven dormant state, right? So that they can basically sleep and not age during this incredibly long trip, right? So we don't have a natural mechanism for that. So the animal isn't necessarily going to be completely asleep during the entire time. It would need to burn additional energy during the winter to be able to stay active. And so this is a very complicated looking graph, but the main point of it is that going dormant, going to sleep, or going to hibernate in the winter saves it a lot of energy. All right, so all of this orange area on this graph is all of the energy that was saved by, it wakes up, it eats a little bit, it does its bathroom, and then it goes back to sleep again. So these arousals are these sort of periodic wakings. All right, so we as humans, we think a lot about our metabolic rate. We think a lot about calories in our diet. Most organisms are out there just desperately trying to get enough to eat. So our current human problem, at least in developed countries, is that we actually have abundant and expensive foods that are very high in calories, in fat, in protein. They taste good, and we eat more than we need. But the way that our body controls the amount of weight that we have, the amount of fat stores, it actually is trying to constantly maintain homeostasis. So it's very, very hard to lose weight or gain weight, depending on what your sort of current metabolic state is, because your body's kind of used to it and wants to keep it the same, right? So we have these mechanisms that try and keep us the same. So even if you eat extra on a certain day, the good news is that your body's gonna actually try and burn that excess rather than store it. However, unfortunately, that also means that if you don't eat as much or you exercise more, the body is going to sort of try and hang on to any extra calories that you have, and it isn't actually going to start burning fat. It'll just get a little more efficient at doing things. So when we want to change something about our bodies, we're actually working against this evolved set of systems to try and keep us the same, right? So it's very, very challenging to try and do that. All right, that is the end of our lecture for today.